Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Golden Girls, Season 1, Episodes 3 and 4. Thank you everyone who had watched the very first review of this, the pilot episode and the second episode. And so reasonably, because there was actual views on that review, I decided okay, let's see where this goes. Let's see where this takes us. Really also, when really looking at the pulp culture eventually that the Golden Girls eventually goes into, I remember seeing the one Golden Girls-esh skit from the animated or the stop motion show Robot Chicken, where they bizarrely end up having the Golden Girls, but it's done from a Sex in the City kind of theme. And I really did thought that was kind of hilarious. But I still didn't even know what Golden Girls actually was at that point. I've seen little blips and little stuff or whatever, but I really didn't get to go into the show at that time. But it's also interesting to also reflect on the fact that I'm a consistent AEW watcher also, and we have CM Punk, who ended up going onto an after show, and eventually him and Luchasaurus and Jungle Boy were to eventually kind of be with CM Punk, and he all of a sudden is to have the whole entire crowd go on and sing the Golden Girls on one episode of AEW Dark. So you can go ahead and check that out online. But yeah, so the Golden Girls have affected pop culture, and let me know in the comments below if there has been ever a time where eventually you found this show by some other means, by just really just knowing the show or whatever stories that eventually you have where maybe some family member of yours eventually kind of had you go and watch this show, or maybe eventually you just stumbled upon it for whatever reason. Just let me know in the comments below your story about finding the show. Again, for me, it was just simply enough where it's it seems like enough people are talking about this show. I should probably check it out. So, going into these episodes, I really think from the first two episodes, I really think that the stuff going on in these episodes are honestly just really even better than the first two episodes. We end up having characters who have these long stretches of stories, which I really thoroughly thought were really fun and hilarious and whatever. And we really start to break down certain characters and who they are in these episodes, considering the first two were to just kind of have something being introduced in this episode, where eventually the girls had to have to carry through the whole story for you to just kind of get to know these characters, but really not know who they actually are quite yet. Where it seems like these characters build up these characters a little bit more to where you get much more of a backstory than probably Dorothy's kind of ex-husband story that was really interesting from the other episode. It just seems like we start to get to know, especially in episode 3, because everyone is to just kind of talk about how active they had ever been. Meaning any men who eventually they were to lay beside into a bed at some point. We end up really in episode 3 have Dorothy kind of consistently making jokes to Blanche about how many men that she had probably slept with. And I just thought that was hilarious, where we end up having Dorothy, who's kind of making fun of Blanche, where it's the Navy had said that Blanche was also a certified open port. And so there's that whole joke in episode 3. So really what is to break down in episode 3 in a very teeing up like fashion uh, really is just to have Rose eventually find a man that she is to go off on a cruise with. And Rose is like, well, I'm a little scared because like I don't know if this guy Arnie, like if he is eventually going to want seemingly more and more out of this relationship, meaning that Rose had ever only slept with one other man, and that is the man that she married. And so Rose is kind of going into this like being or having a long stretch of time between her last husband and this new suitor who is to be Arnie. So it seems that Rose is kind of reflecting on her past lover with Arnie. And and also Rose is just kind of just uh she's very much like scared of this whole event that is to possibly unfold. And so it really creates a very interesting story in episode 3. So episode 4 we end up having Dorothy's daughter who is to eventually drop off her new baby. And it seems weird in this episode because it seems like Dorothy is just kind of holding the baby weirdly. Because a lot of times, like they'll tell you that like if you're to hold the baby, you're to like support the neck and like cradle and whatever. And because I had at one point held a child, a baby, or whatever. And so really they kind of tell you like the technique that you're supposed to have. And so uh really just it was kind of odd at like some spots where it kind of feels that like shouldn't she be holding the baby a certain way, but you're really probably thinking that the entire time that what really happened is they just have uh like a doll with them, but like all the like close up shots are to be like separate or separated. So that way like it's much easier to not have to actually work with a baby during a show, because you basically have to like it's a live audience and it's whatever, and so it's probably just a lot easier to just have like a doll present, and then in certain kind of shots just have like the actual baby present. So but anyways, so in episode 4, the big reason why this episode is to be called implant, or yeah. So eventually, we end up finding out that Blanche's sister is to supposedly need a kidney transplant, and it's either that or she could quite possibly die. And so now Blanche is trying to like go back and forth and just be like, well, I don't know if I should donate this or not, but like, because what is going to happen if like my organs start failing and I don't have a spare, and like who am I going to turn to? And so we have that kind of build up in this episode, and we really just kind of find out who these characters are. And that's where I just really am like just interested about the show, because it's not all just about jokes. It's kind of like getting us to further understand who these people are. Um, Plus, I really enjoy like Sophia in these episodes, especially the episode I think which is just episode 3, where we have like Sophia and Dorothy going and trying to play gin, and like Sophia is trying to tempt Dorothy to play gin again, and we get some pretty interesting moments out of that. So like so far, still really enjoying the show. It's really fun. So I think basically in a very roundabout way, I will like review this show to eventually not have everything be perfectly in line with the way that the episode is set up. Like that's going to be obvious through this review, but so far, still enjoying the show. If people are to continue to review this, I will continue to watch it. So we'll see how that all plays out. Because I'm like, Here's also the thing. Like, I have a cluster of a number of projects still to go out, but without a doubt, if this continues to go well, I will continue to come back to it. Um, like, a lot of things seem like a lot of one-off experiences is most of the time because they barely end up getting a one-off review or review. So hence why I just experiment a lot. But if this review does well, which is to just mean if it does a thing, then I will try to come back to the show and keep reviewing it. So, with that said, let's go into that double five time territory because it's that customary time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get into spoil this episode or episodes. So yeah, so this is the episode where Blanche is to desperately go off to her friends and to ask them to go with her on this double date. Because it seems that Blanche's guy is to have this this friend, and so Blanche is now desperately asking all the girls, like, "Hey, do you want to go and have a double with me?" And like Sophia is just like, "Well, I'll go," and Blanche is like, "I'm sorry." So Blanche is trying to ask Dorothy to like, "Hey, do you want to go on a double?" And Dorothy's like, "No, I'm playing cards with my mother, and I finally want to beat her in gin." And so it seems that Dorothy at first was going well in gin, but then all of a sudden, like, her mother ends up coming back and starting to like beat her, and so eventually, somewhere down the road, like Sophia is to just tempt Dorothy in this episode to want to play cards again, and that like Sophia will give Dorothy like a handicap to basically like, "I'll give you like 25 points." Like, and like Dorothy's like, "You know what? I've given up on trying to beat you in cards. Like, it's just never gonna happen." So but eventually Blanche is to bump into Rose, and so Blanche is like, "Well, hey, like, how about you and me go on a double date?" And Rose is like, "Well, that sounds fun. Like, why not go ahead and go ahead and do this?" So Blanche and Rose go on this double date, and so Rose, I guess, had gone, I guess, on one date before this, and evidently the guy had been a dud and had talked about like having some problems with his like prostate or whatever, like, or something like that. And so Dorothy is to mention, it's like, "Well, that guy is like from Minnesota. It's lucky that he even has a prostate because it's so cold there." I'm like, Minnesota reference, yeah. I love Minnesota references because that's where I'm from. Weirdly. So yeah, like, why do I have what Minnesota? Why do I have that kind of weird pride of a thing? But it doesn't really matter because I'm not. I'm. Who knows if I'm ever gonna like live here forever? Anyways. But it's just that weird, bizarre thing where it's like, "Hey, name of state? Yeah." They reference it. Like, eventually you end up going and like watching movies, and coincidentally someone is from Minnesota, and you just want to say like, you just want to like assess like, "Oh, is this guy quite accurate? I don't think so. Like, I don't think he's a quite accurate Minnesota person." So because you always have that about your own state where you're just like going and like, "Yeah, this guy obviously isn't from Oregon or Delaware or Brazil or wherever you're from." Um, like, there is nothing like that that seems like this guy would be from my place of which I, anyways. But we don't actually have that in this show. So, anyways, so Rose and Blanche are to come back home, and so evidently Blanche was to have gotten the dud, to where it seemed that anything that this guy was to do, or anything for Blanche was to suggest for this guy to do, this guy had some kind of problem, where eventually Blanche was to ask this guy to dance, and supposedly this guy is like, "Well, no, like my ankles will swell if I dance," or like There's always some kind of problem that Blanche's guy was to have. But then Rose's guy is to just kind of walk Rose to the door, and it seems like they were gonna have this like moment and whatever, and like they hugged it out, and so Sophia was like, "Hey, get a room, you two." So Rose is to go on and tell her friends that seemingly uh, Arnie is to want to have them be on a cruise together because everything is going so smoothly. And Rose is like, yeah, I don't know, because like maybe we'll end up sleeping together. And like the last person that I ever slept with was my husband who ended up dying, and he's the only ever man I've ever really been with. And so then we start having like the girls kind of talking about their times that they had slept with someone. Dorothy, after Stanley had left, had gone and seemingly slept with her divorce lawyer, and Blanche ended up calling that out. And Blanche was like, "Well, yeah, I'm sure you slept with your divorce lawyer." Dorothy's like, "Well, how do you know that?" And Blanche is like, "Well, because it's always the divorce lawyer." And so Dorothy's like, "Well, yeah." Anyways, so uh, we ended up having like Sophia. I think she ended up talking about Dorothy's father, and so like Dorothy was just kind of like, I don't know if I want to hear this. And so Blanche had kind of mentioned that like she had been with a seemingly a number of men. And so Dorothy's like, well, yeah, like you're certified that your port is open and for business, so to speak. So yeah, like we know that you've had like a longevous amount of throes of passion, let's just say. So, and that's to be like the joke throughout the episode. So, uh, eventually Rose is to go on to this cruise with Arnie. And so eventually it leads to uh, eventually Rose and Arnie, like Rose is to mention like certain things that are to be just like her previous husband that she ends up seeing in Arnie. And Arnie's like, well, you know what? Like that's great that I can like remind you of somebody, but like really like I just don't want you to see him when you're looking at me. Like it's just like I'm my own man kind of thing. So Rose is to eventually just be like kind of tempted to eventually go into seemingly some bedroom business with Arnie, but so eventually she ends up deciding instead to run off in the bathroom and to just be in tears instead. So Arnie eventually at some point is to try to knock on Rose's door because he's like, you know what? To be like a gentleman, like I will go and seek out like another room to give you space. And like Arnie's really just also saying it's like, well, hey, I also need like my contact lenses in there. So like, hey, if you could just get out of the bathroom so I can just get all my stuff and I'll just leave and go into another room. And so Rose finally is to come out, and supposedly she is to mention that like her eyes look awful from all the crying that she had done. And Arnie's like, well, I can't see you because again, no contact lenses. So uh, eventually Rose is to finally confess to Arnie that Rose ended up killing her husband in the throes of passion. And Arnie is like, well, because Rose is just like, well, maybe I'll end up killing you. And Arnie's like, well, yeah, if you probably haven't done it in a really long time, you probably will. But Arnie's like joking about all this because it's like, hey, like, and eventually Arnie is to take Rose and just be like, hey, Rose, whatever you want to do is fine with me. Like, they can take it as slowly as they want to. And because I think Arnie is to also mention about his wife, and how eventually there was to be this accident where he was to lose her, and that eventually he ended up going and finding another woman and sleeping with that woman. And he ended up feeling lousy about it, but I guess, like he always says, is like, well, or he says, is like, well, that's the thing with men. It's like they can just go and just easily work through this, because they can just go ahead and just like sleep with whoever, just because it's like it just like they end up just kind of like forgetting about it and moving on, where I guess maybe women must feel differently about it. So but yeah, so eventually the real ending of this is that uh eventually Rose is to eventually go and not have Arnie go into another room. And so eventually they kind of stay and do the cruise and like just really enjoy themselves. And so Rose is to eventually come back from the cruise. And so now all the girls are kind of gossiping. They're like, "Oh my God, did she do it? Did she not do it? Like I'm kind of curious. I want to know." And so Dorothy's like, "Hold on a minute. Hold up, everyone. Like, how about we just don't question her and just kind of leave it be? And if she tells us, she tells us. If she doesn't, it's perfectly fine." So, but hey, just don't forcibly bring it up. So, immediately once Rose comes through the door, uh, Sophia is just like, "Hey, Rose, did you guys play hide the salami?" And so Rose is just like, "Oh my God." So Rose is to just go on and just be like, "Well, like a lady never tells." And so Rose just does not want to tell the girls whether she did it or not. But Dorothy is just to tell her, it's like, "Okay, how about we easily do this? You're going to go and you're going to put your luggage in your room. If you quickly come back after putting your luggage in your room, it means that you and Arnie did it. If you go and you stay in that room and you unpack all of your stuff, that means that you didn't do it." So all of a sudden, Rose is to go into the room and then quickly come back, and the girls are like, "Yeah, like she did it. Like she got her groove back or whatever." And so Rose is like, "Yeah, me and Arnie, it was wonderful." And so like eventually they end up kind of just like just talking things out and whatever. And so I think at the tail end of this, maybe like it's either the tail end of this or the tail end of the other episode. I think it's the other episode where they all end up scrambling off to go and get ice cream. I think that's probably the other episode. Um, where yeah, I think this episode is just to kind of like end with them kind of like finally like cementing that Rose and Arnie are going to be this seemingly couple, I guess. Probably just for this one episode, because that's usually what ends up happening. But so yeah, so the fourth episode. The fourth episode, let's get into it. So, like once we actually get IMDb, I forgot to kind of set this all up. So yeah, it's not implant; it's called transplant. I don't know, I said something probably incorrectly there. I apologize. So in episode 4, we of course have Dorothy's daughter who is to drop off this baby, because evidently Dorothy's daughter's husband is to, I guess, have hurt himself, so he needs to go to surgery. So, like Dorothy's daughter is to leave this baby here for a number of days, and so, so we have certain characters who are playing around with it. We end up having Rose, who's like goo goo gaga in front of the baby, and Sophia's like, "Oh, so now like she has someone to really just talk to now," and because like they're the only ones that can probably understand one another. So So eventually, what ends up happening at some point in this episode is that Dorothy is upset because evidently the baby was up all night, and so now the baby is like awake during the day, and like we end up finding out that Rose, uh, like didn't see the baby the whole day, and so she like woke the baby up in the middle of the night to like try and play around with him to just kind of see him because she didn't have the ability to. So so eventually in this episode, Blanche is to uh, eventually have her sister be coming over. And so eventually, when Virginia is to appear in this episode, we end up having Blanche, who's kind of consistently making fun of Virginia, kind of mentioning that, like, oh, hey, are you going to go and get some surgery to kind of fix, like, your turkey neck or something like that? And so we end up having Virginia, who is to be with Blanche and just kind of is to kind of check out, I guess, her home and her friends and whatever. And so we have Virginia that is to mention to Blanche, it's like, well, all your friends are lovely. And like everything here is just so lovely. And Blanche is like, well, like, why are you saying lovely like that? Like, it just seems like the way that you're like mentioning this just kind of seems like kind of like a sarcastic kind of delivery. And so Virginia is just like, well, like I guess because Virginia things aren't going well for her, that eventually she's gonna possibly die. Like I guess a lot of this could probably seem sarcastic just because it's like, well, like Virginia is probably gonna be at the end of her rope, sadly, uh, via this episode. So eventually Virginia is to go with Blanche to go to this restaurante where Virginia is going to drop the bomb on Blanche that she's like, well, Blanche, I'm dying. Like, that's the reason why I came here, to just kind of talk to you, to maybe say my final goodbyes or something like that. Um, and so Blanche all of a sudden is to go to her friends and is to mention, it's like, well, my sister needs a kidney transplant and I'm a possible donor. And so we have Dorothy, Rose, and Sophia who are just to mention, like, well, like if I had to donate my organ to somebody, like they're kind of questioning to all of them whether they would do it or not, and just to kind of like just think about if they had that ultimatum on like on their plate, which they don't because Sophia, but like it helps kind of Sophia or Sophia, Blanche make up her decision to want to eventually give up her kidney or not, which is kind of an interesting story here. So, uh, so eventually uh, we have Dorothy mention that like if it were her children, like she would give up any organ possible just to keep them alive, and so Rose is to just be like, well, if I had a kid, like I would give up any of my organs too, even if it was like my heart, like I would quickly give it up. And so eventually Rose was to mention that that she eventually had this dog where Rose was to say, it's like, well, I could possibly give up even my kidney if it meant that my dog could have lived. And Sophia's like, what? Like, you would give up an organ so that way your dog can continue to pee on your carpet? And Rose is like, well, like when really looking at it, this dog had gave me like so many things, like and gave me so much like comfort and whatever a normal dog would kind of give to people, like man's best friend and all that stuff. To where Rose would just like, well, yeah, maybe I would give up an organ, like for my for a pet of mine to continue to live. And so like eventually we also have like Sophia, like of course mentioning that like if any of her family members would of course need an organ, like she would give it up also easily. So Blanche is to come up with this like decision, because eventually she's like, well, what if my organs start to crap out? Like, then like I'm not gonna have anybody to donate this to, and we end up also having Blanche asking Virginia about like, well, what about any of the other like family members that we are to have? And supposedly Virginia is to mention that the one other person that she ends up going and asking, like Blanche is to call her some weird mutant, because Virginia is to say that this one girl that she ended up asking, weirdly enough, her kidneys were like attached together. So evidently, like she couldn't donate to Virginia, weirdly, and so Blanche was like, yeah, like that girl is just kind of really interesting because she had every single excuse because of some part of her body to get out of like every single thing. She ended up getting out of chores. She ended up getting out of doing any number of things because there was some part of her body that would just have this kind of thing about it to where she just got out of like doing everything in her life. So I just thought that was kind of really funny. So eventually, like Virginia is to say goodbye to Blanche and just say it's like, well, hey, like I know this is a really tough decision, but if you decide to do this, like you can meet me in Atlanta in X amount of number of days. So Blanche is to go back and forth about all this, and so eventually by the end of the episode she decides that she wants to go and donate to her sister because it's the right thing to do. So eventually Blanche is to go and see if she is a possible donator for her sister. And so eventually what ends up happening is Blanche is to come back to the group, and so she is to mention like, well, hey, uh like guess what, like I didn't have to donate my kidneys and my sister is fine. And so like, wait, what happened, like what's going on? And so evidently Blanche is to mention that evidently her like something about her blood could not let Blanche donate this kidney because, like, I guess it just would not have worked out. So now the girls are like, but wait a minute. So, like, but what about your sister, though? And come to find out, it seemed that Virginia luckily got a donor at the right time. And it was to be some girl who eventually became this, like, nun. And so Blanche is just like, well, yeah, like, so Virginia got like the best of both worlds. She ended up getting like this kidney that like is like basically like mint in condition because like of course this girl didn't go into being an alcoholic or any number of things. So like this kidney is like the best perfect kind of kidney that this girl could get. And so eventually it ends up that like all the girls end up running off to go and having a thing of ice cream after this to just kind of celebrate this whole moment. So really, with that said, I think I covered most of this episode. There might be some stretches of dialogue that I didn't go into perfectly or whatever, but like I wanted to go in here in the kind of like the quickest way possible to eventually just kind of talk about this episode. But yeah, like because I got like I think most of the big moments or whichever. So with that said, yeah, let me know in the comments below how you probably felt about these episodes. If maybe you're a person that likes to consistently watch this kind of show, maybe it's your favorite show or whichever. I'm really enjoying the kind of the dialogue going on here and the real joking parts. I think in the first two episodes, I really enjoyed the Dorothy character. But I think I'm starting to overall like start to like the ensemble as a whole. But yeah, so I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.